So we talked about perennial staple trees and perennial crops before. Here it's a slightly different thing in terms of coming attractions where it is more of a perennialization of crops. So when we were hunter-gatherers before the agricultural lifestyle started, domestication of various crops like cereals and oil seeds and legumes and so on started around, let's say, 10,000 years ago. We relied on wild grains and fruits and tubers and roots and berries and whatever. And at some point, human beings got smart and domesticated the essentially perennial grasses and so on, like wheat, and made them annuals to increase the yield. And annual cropping is, basically has been responsible for enormous amount of land degradation, deforestation, soil erosion, loss of soil nutrients, soil health, and water retention capacity, drought resilience, and so on and so forth, of course, and carbon sequestration. So idea of perennial crops is this I took from Land Institute. I will show the link in a minute. Perennial crops. Why perennial crops? So perennial plants do not have to be reseeded or replanted every year, so they do not require annual plowing or herbicide applications to establish. Whereas to successfully grow annuals, farmers have to suppress or kill the vegetation or weeds chemically or mechanically that compete with crops for sunlight, nutrients, and water, especially when the crops are seedlings. This soil disturbance has caused significant amount of soil carbon loss, which ends up in the atmosphere as CO2, of course, and has caused soil erosion, nutrient leakage, and changes in soil organisms. We talked about microbial farming, and that's basically to make up for this practice of annual cropping, which has resulted in a loss of soil microbiome. Perennial crops are robust. They protect soil from erosion and improve soil structure. Anything that sequesters more carbon is going to improve soil structure. They increase ecosystem nutrient retention, also related to water holding capacity, which is related to carbon content, carbon sequestration and water infiltration, and can contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation. Overall, they help ensure food and water security over the long term. Many fruit, forage, and some vegetable crops, including fruit trees, alfalfa, grapes, asparagus, and olive trees, are perennials that have been grown for thousands of years. If you go to a vineyard, you know that dry-looking plants are actually not dead. They are able to bear fruit year after year. The Land Institute is working to add perennial grains, legumes, and oilseeds crops to the list. So they want to create perennials out of what may have become annuals, or identify crops that can be perennial. Perennial crops can free farmers from treadmill of economic instability by significantly reducing the need for costly inputs and minimizing the operational expenses of tillage and planting. This new perennial hardware for agriculture stands to catalyze a rich culture around food production and supply chain development. Research is emerging to understand the social and economic strategies needed to support these new agricultural systems, the perennial agriculture. Given that grains make up over 70% of our global caloric consumption and over 70% of our global croplands transitioning from an extractive annual mode to perennial mode is the best chance we have to create a truly regenerative food future. So, just to emphasize, this is about creating new perennial crops or versions of perennial crops from what we have made into annual crops. Okay, here is an example. Krenza Wheat at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. The mature wheat will be tied into bundles and fed to small combine for thrashing. So this has been made into a perennial wheat. Here is again Krenza. Sorry, I shouldn't say Krenza. It's Krenza, the trademark name for the processed grain domesticated from intermediate wheatgrass, a perennial cousin of modern wheat. Is currently the only perennial grain in product on the market. So this is again from the Land Institute. Here are some scientists, Lee Dehan, lead Krenza scientist at the Land Institute, and Kayla Altendorf, a research assistant at the University of Minnesota, examined Krenza plants in a research plot at the Land Institute's campus in Salina, Kansas. Okay, amazing stuff, right? Here's an example of a perennial rice. Feng Yi Hu shows a perennial rice plant which has deeper roots than cultivated rice varieties. So if you go back in time, wheat came out in the Fertile Crescent at the Middle East. Corn came out in South America, I think, and rice came out in Asia. So the research for perennialization is going in different places across the world. This is Stan Cox examining the head of a perennial sorghum plant. This is again from the Land Institute. The Land Institute has developed this perennial sorghum hybrid by combining an annual species with a perennial weed called Johnson grass. How about that? That's kind of a breeding. Just to repeat, annual grains like cereals, oilseeds, and legumes are planted on almost 70% of the croplands, and all of them are in various state of erosion and degradation and topsoil loss, nutrient depletion, carbon loss, and so on and so forth. So here are some annual wheat versus perennial intermediate wheatgrass. You see the annual and the perennial. So perennials basically don't lose the root. So annuals have to be grown, especially with seeds. They lose the entire biomass, including the roots. And perennialization basically means the roots get longer, and while the above ground biomass may die, the roots remain, and they give all these extra benefits to soil. So this is the fall variety, winter, spring, and summer. Seasonal development of annual winter wheat and its wild perennial relative intermediate wheatgrass. Plant breeding programs are working to domesticate intermediate wheatgrass and to develop perennial wheat by crossing with wheat. So these are something that will be crossed with the domesticated wheat annual crop to develop perennial crops. Here is an example of trying to create demand for perennial wheat like Krenza wheat. So this is in 2016, Patagonia Provisions launched a long root ale, the first Krenza product on the market. Okay, so people will get used to it. So the Land Institute, here is the link, is also has a global inventory project, an ambitious large-scale global collaboration between the Land Institute, the Missouri Botanical Garden, one of the largest research botanical gardens, and St. Louis University to identify perennial species candidates for domestication and use in perennial polycultures in temperate and tropical climates where most of the degraded land exists and most of the food security concerns exist and most of the poverty and climate impacts also are occurring.